At 48 years old, I walked away from the highest paying job I'd ever had. I was making a little over $90,000 a year. Good benefits, retirement contributions, paid vacation, a steady paycheck every 2 weeks. And I gave it up for an online job that paid me barely a third of that. When I told people what I was doing, most of them thought I'd lost my mind. And when I told them I was moving to the Philippines alone, that pretty much confirmed it for them. No husband waiting for me, no boyfriend, no family over there. I wasn't retiring, I wasn't wealthy, I still needed to work. I was just tired of spending my entire life waiting for a few days each year when I was finally allowed to enjoy it. 6 months after I left, my old company contacted me. They wanted me back, and they were willing to pay me more than I'd ever made before. For a few days, I came very close to going home. By then, the smaller paycheck, the strange work hours, and being alone so far from home had started to feel a lot more real. To explain why I even considered going back, I have to explain why I left in the first place. For most of my adult life, work was the center of everything. I started full-time in my early 20s, changed companies a couple of times, got promoted, took on more responsibility, and eventually ended up making more money than I'd ever expected. I never had children. I never got married. I had relationships over the years, but none of them became the thing I built my life around. Work was the thing that stayed. And to be fair, it gave me a comfortable life. I had a nice place to live, a dependable car, savings, and enough money that I wasn't panicking every time something broke. I was doing fine. The problem was, I wasn't doing much besides working. And I kept telling myself I was going to start living someday. I've always been fascinated by other countries, not just resorts or beaches. I liked learning how people actually lived, what they ate, how families spent their time, what regular neighborhoods looked like. I'd watch videos from the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, sometimes for hours. I'd save places on my phone that I wanted to see. I'd look at airfare. I'd build little imaginary trips. Then Monday would come, and I'd go back to work. I had a list of countries I'd wanted to visit for years. You know how many of them I'd actually been to? None. Every year I told myself the same thing. Maybe next year. Maybe after this project. Maybe when things calm down at work. The problem was, things never calmed down. If anything, the better I got at my job, the harder it became to leave. People depended on me. If somebody called out, I covered. If there was a deadline, I stayed late. If something went wrong while I was supposed to be off, my phone still rang. And vacation? That became almost a joke. I'd request a week off months ahead of time, then something would happen. Someone would leave. We'd get busy. A major project would get pushed into the same week. My manager would ask if I could move my vacation. And most of the time, I did. The company allowed us to cash out some unused paid time off. At first, I thought that was great. Why waste it? I'd get an extra check and tell myself I could use the money for a bigger trip later. So I'd cash out the vacation, take the money, and keep working. I did that for years. Then one afternoon, I was looking at another PTO payout, and instead of being happy about the extra money, it annoyed me. I remember thinking, wait a minute. I'm getting paid because I never use the vacation I've earned. Every year I tell myself I'm going to travel, and every year I take the money instead. I had enough money to take a trip. That wasn't the problem. The problem was getting enough time away from work to actually go. And that was when I finally admitted something to myself. Making more money wasn't fixing the part of my life I was unhappy with. That thought stayed with me for months. I didn't walk into work the next morning and quit. I'm not that impulsive. If anything, I probably overthink decisions. So I started looking around. At first, I wasn't even thinking about moving overseas. I just wanted to know if there was a job I could do without having to be in the same office 5 days a week. Remote work wasn't new to me. I knew people did it. I just assumed those jobs were mostly for programmers, designers, or people with skills I didn't have. Then I started looking at positions that used the experience I'd already spent years building: customer accounts, administrative work, scheduling, online support, operations, things that didn't require me to reinvent myself. And there were jobs out there. The problem was the pay. I remember opening one listing and thinking there had to be a mistake. The responsibilities weren't that different from things I'd already been doing. The salary was around $32,000 a year. I was making more than $90,000. I closed the page. Absolutely not. Then I opened it again about 20 minutes later, because there was one sentence I couldn't stop thinking about. The position was fully remote, not hybrid, not 3 days at home and 2 days in an office. Remote. And this particular job allowed me to work internationally, as long as I had reliable internet and kept the required hours. That was the part that got my attention. That's when the numbers in my head started changing. Until then, I'd been comparing $32,000 to my life in America. My rent, my car, insurance, gas, groceries, everything that came with maintaining the life I already had. Of course, $32,000 sounded terrible. But what if I wasn't living that life anymore? What if my apartment didn't cost what it cost? What if I didn't need a car? What if I wasn't trying to maintain the same lifestyle? And that brought me back to all those places I'd spent years watching from my couch, especially the Philippines. I'd been interested in the country for a long time. The markets always caught my attention. The food, the mix of busy cities and quieter areas. The fact that English was widely spoken made the idea feel a little less intimidating. Then I started looking at what normal day-to-day expenses could actually cost in the Philippines. That's when the whole idea started looking possible. I didn't need $90,000 a year to do this, not even close. Of course, watching somebody else's budget on YouTube and living on your own money are two completely different things. I knew that. I wasn't expecting some $500 a month fantasy where I'd live in a beachfront condo and eat restaurant meals 3 times a day. I started building a real budget: housing, electricity, internet, food, transportation, health insurance, visa expenses, flights, emergency savings, and I added extra because I'd rather overestimate than arrive halfway around the world and discover I'd been lying to myself with a spreadsheet. Even then, the numbers worked. Not with the same financial cushion I had in America. That part scared me. But they worked. I applied for the remote job. I didn't tell anybody at work. I didn't tell my friends. I didn't even tell my family at first. Because applying was one thing. Actually taking it would mean giving up almost $60,000 a year, and I still wasn't sure I could do that. Then they emailed me. They wanted an interview. A week later, I had another one, and a few days after that, I got the offer. $33,000 a year, full-time, remote. I read the email at least 4 times. I should have been excited. Instead, I felt sick. Because until that moment, quitting was still just an idea. Now I had an actual job offer sitting in front of me. I had to decide if I really meant all those things I'd been telling myself. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night with my laptop open. On one side, I wrote down everything my current job gave me: salary, health benefits, retirement match, paid time off, job security. On the other side, I wrote what the new job gave me. One thing: freedom. I stared at those two lists for a long time. One side looked responsible. The other side looked almost reckless. Then I did something that changed the way I looked at the entire decision. I calculated how many years I had until I turned 65. 17. 17 more years. That's when I stopped asking myself how much money I would lose by leaving. I started asking how much time I was willing to lose by staying. I accepted the offer 3 days later. Then I had to do the part that scared me more than applying for it. I had to quit. For years I had been the reliable one, the person who stayed late, the person who knew how everything worked, the person people called when something went wrong. So walking into my manager's office and saying I was leaving felt almost unnatural. He assumed I'd found another company offering more money. When I told him I was taking a remote position that paid substantially less, he just stared at me. I could see him trying to figure out what I wasn't telling him. Then he asked where the new company was located. I told him that wasn't really the point. I could work remotely, and I was planning to spend some time in Southeast Asia. That got an even longer pause. He finally said something like, "You're giving up this job so you can travel?" And hearing somebody else say it out loud made the whole thing sound ridiculous. For about 5 seconds, I wanted to take it back. Not because I didn't want to go, because suddenly I was aware of everything I was giving up. I'd worked years to reach that salary, and now I was choosing to make much less. That was hard to explain, even to myself. For years, more money meant I was doing better. A better position meant I was doing better. A bigger retirement account meant I was doing better. I just hadn't spent much time asking myself if I actually liked the life that came with it. News traveled around the office quickly. Most people were supportive. Some were confused. A couple of coworkers told me they wished they could do the same thing. One person asked if I was having some kind of midlife crisis. Maybe I was. If wanting to finally use my own time counts as a crisis, then I guess that's what it was. My family had more practical concerns. What about health care? What if the remote job didn't work out? What if I hated the Philippines? What if I got lonely? What if I wanted my old career back and couldn't get it? Those were fair questions. I had asked myself all of them, and I didn't have perfect answers. That was probably the hardest part for me. I'd spent most of my life trying to make decisions where I could predict the outcome. This one didn't come with that. I did have a backup plan. I wasn't selling everything I owned and putting every dollar I had into some crazy idea. I had savings. I kept an emergency fund separate. I made sure I had enough money to return to the United States if I needed to. And I told myself I wasn't committing to forever. I was going to try something different. If it didn't work, I'd adjust. That sounds simple now. At the time, it took everything in me to believe it. My last day at work was strange. People brought food. There were hugs. A few jokes about me sending pictures from the beach while everyone else was stuck in meetings. I cleaned out my desk, turned in my badge, walked to my car, and sat there without starting the engine. For the first time in more than 20 years, I didn't have a workplace to return to the following Monday. I expected to feel excited. Instead, I cried. Not because I regretted leaving. I think I was grieving a version of myself. That job had become part of my identity. When people asked what I did, I had an answer. I had a title. I had a salary that made me feel successful. Now I had a laptop job paying $33,000 a year and a plan that sounded questionable every time I explained it. A few weeks later, I boarded a flight to the Philippines. I'd pictured that flight so many times that I thought it would feel like this huge moment. It didn't. I was tired, nervous, checking my documents over and over, making sure my onward travel was in order, worrying about whether my luggage was overweight, wondering if my bank cards were going to work when I landed. It didn't feel like some big movie moment. It felt like a long travel day where I happened to be moving to another country. And maybe that's what made it finally feel real. Because I wasn't going on vacation. I was trying to figure out whether I could actually build a life this way. What I didn't know yet was that the first few weeks were going to make this decision look brilliant. And then, almost overnight, I was going to start wondering whether everyone back home had been right. My first few weeks in the Philippines were probably the most excited I'd felt in years. Everything was new, even ordinary things. Walking into a grocery store, trying food I hadn't seen before, figuring out transportation, stopping somewhere for coffee and realizing I didn't have anywhere I needed to be afterward. I kept catching myself thinking, I can actually do this. And financially, those first days felt almost too good. I'd look at the price of a meal and immediately compare it to what I'd been paying back home. Transportation felt inexpensive. My temporary place cost far less than my old monthly housing expenses. I didn't have a car payment, no gasoline, no expensive commute, no grabbing an overpriced lunch because I'd forgotten to pack something for work. For the first time, earning $33,000 a year didn't feel embarrassing. It felt like I'd discovered some secret. I know that sounds naive. It was. Because I was still looking at every purchase individually. A few dollars here, a few dollars there. Nothing seemed expensive enough to worry about. So I ate out constantly, took rides everywhere, ordered things I thought would make the apartment more comfortable, bought imported foods because I recognized the brands, tried different cafes, went exploring on my days off. And because I had spent years earning a much higher salary, I still had the spending habits of somebody making $90,000. That didn't disappear just because my paycheck got smaller. The first remote paycheck hit my account while I was in the Philippines. That was the moment things started feeling different. I remember looking at the deposit. There was nothing wrong with it. It was exactly what I expected. But my brain still compared it to what I used to earn. That old paycheck would have been much bigger. And suddenly I noticed every dollar differently. A dinner that had seemed cheap the week before didn't feel quite as cheap. A ride I could have avoided suddenly mattered. The imported groceries I'd thrown into my cart without thinking looked ridiculous when I added them up. This wasn't vacation money anymore. This was my income. Then came the work schedule. That part surprised me. I had been so focused on being able to work from anywhere that I hadn't really thought about what working from anywhere would feel like. My company was based in the United States. Some of my hours overlapped with their workday. So while people outside were starting their mornings, sometimes I was finishing mine. There were nights when I sat in front of my laptop watching the clock creep past midnight. I'd take off my headset, close the computer, and realize there was nobody to talk to. No coworker walking out with me, no drive home, no familiar routine, just silence. That was when I noticed something I hadn't really thought about before. I'd spent years complaining that work took up too much of my life. But work was also where most of my daily contact with other people came from. I had coworkers to joke with, people to eat lunch with, somebody asking how my weekend was. Even the people who annoyed me were still people I saw every day. Now I could work from anywhere, which was exactly what I'd wanted. But some nights I'd close the laptop and the room felt really empty. I started asking myself questions I had never considered while planning the move. Was I actually happier? Or was I just somewhere new? Did I really want this lifestyle? Or had I built it up in my head because I was so tired of my old routine? And the hardest question was, did I actually want a different life, or had I just really needed a vacation? I didn't know the answer yet, but I was about to get a reason to seriously consider going back. By the third month, I had stopped treating every day like I was on vacation. That helped. I found a place that was comfortable without being expensive. I figured out where to buy the things I actually used instead of automatically choosing imported brands. I started cooking more. I walked when I could. I paid attention to electricity. I learned which little expenses added up and which ones really didn't matter. And slowly, my budget started looking more like the one I'd made before I left America. I wasn't struggling, but I had to think differently. That took some getting used to. For years, if I wanted something small, I bought it. If I wanted to eat out, I didn't check my bank account first. If I needed to replace something, I just replaced it. Now I was earning enough to live on, but not enough to ignore my choices. And there were moments when I missed that feeling of financial ease. Not the office, not the commute, not the constant pressure, just the security. I also learned pretty quickly that moving to another country doesn't make every day exciting. Some days I worked, bought groceries, did laundry, watched something, went to bed. That's it. That probably should have been obvious, but I'd spent so much time imagining this big change that ordinary days almost felt disappointing at first. Eventually, I stopped expecting every day to feel like travel. I needed a normal routine here, too. I just wanted it to be a routine I actually liked. I started building routines that had nothing to do with work. I'd go out in the morning before it got too hot. I found a small place where I liked getting coffee. I started recognizing people in the neighborhood. There was a woman at a little store I visited often who eventually stopped treating me like a stranger. Nothing dramatic, just a smile, a little conversation, a joke here and there. But those small interactions started making a difference. I wasn't constantly exploring anymore. I was living, and that felt different. I also started using my days off the way I'd always imagined I would. Sometimes I'd go somewhere new. Sometimes I'd take a short trip. Sometimes I'd just get on a bus or book a ride and spend the day somewhere I'd never been. There was no vacation request, no checking the office calendar, no wondering if somebody else had already asked for those days. I finished work, and my time was mine. That was the part I had almost forgotten about when I started worrying over the smaller paycheck. By the time I'd been in the Philippines about 6 months, all of this was starting to feel more normal. Then one afternoon, I got an email from my old manager. The subject line looked completely ordinary. Just checking in. At first, I thought he wanted to see how I was doing. We exchanged a few messages. He asked about the Philippines. I told him I was adjusting. I said the remote job was going fine. Then he asked me something I wasn't expecting. Did I have any interest in coming back? My first reaction was no. Immediate, almost automatic. Then I kept reading. They had reorganized some things after I left. They were having trouble replacing the experience I had. And if I was willing to return, they were prepared to offer me a higher salary than I'd been making before. A little over $100,000 a year. I stared at that number for a long time. Because suddenly, this wasn't about whether I missed my old job. It was about what that money could do. I started calculating how much I could save in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, how much more I could put into retirement, how much safer my future would feel. And before I knew it, I was thinking seriously about my old life again. I knew what that life looked like. I knew what I'd earn. I knew what I'd be able to save. And after months of figuring everything out from scratch, there was something really tempting about going back to something familiar. That evening, I opened a spreadsheet, which is probably the least exciting way to decide whether you've made a huge mistake. I compared what I was making now with what I'd make if I went back. Housing, savings, retirement, healthcare, taxes, everything. If I went back and worked another 5 years, I could put away a lot of money. Maybe I could come back to Southeast Asia later with a much bigger cushion. The numbers were making a pretty good argument for going home. And that's when the doubts came back harder than before. Maybe I had left too soon. Maybe 48 wasn't the time to walk away from my highest earning years. Maybe I should have stayed until 55 or 60. Maybe the responsible thing was to go home, make as much as I could, and try this again later. I started looking at flights. I didn't book anything, but I looked. I even checked apartments back home, just to see. And for a couple of days, I let myself imagine returning. The strangest part was how quickly I could picture slipping back into that life. I knew exactly what it would look like. I'd find a place to live, probably get another car, go back to the same office, see familiar faces, start receiving those larger paychecks again. My retirement account would grow faster. I'd stop checking prices so closely. People would probably tell me I'd made the sensible choice. And maybe I would believe them. For a while. Then I caught myself doing something that bothered me. I started saying, I could always travel again later. Later. There was that word again. The same word I'd been using for years. Later, when work slows down. Later, when I save more. Later, when the timing is better. Later, when I'm older. And I knew myself well enough to know what would probably happen. I'd go back. I'd tell myself I was only staying a few years. Then something would come up. A promotion, a bonus, another raise. Maybe the company would need me through a transition. 5 years would become 7. 7 could become 10. And suddenly I'd be standing in the same kitchen at 58 or 60 years old, asking myself why I still hadn't gone anywhere. The money mattered. I wasn't pretending a $100,000 salary meant nothing. That was more retirement money, more savings, a much bigger safety net. But I had to ask myself how much I actually needed. I had a place to live, food, health care, savings, and a job I could do from my laptop. I could still put money away, just slower. And for once, I actually had time to do something besides work. A few mornings later, I woke up early. I made coffee and sat outside before starting my day. It was a Tuesday, nothing special about it. People were already moving around, motorcycles passing, someone sweeping outside, a dog barking somewhere nearby. The air was warm even though the sun hadn't been up very long, and I suddenly thought about what Tuesday used to mean. Alarm, shower, traffic, office, email, meetings, lunch at my desk if things were busy, drive home, dinner, maybe an hour or two to myself before getting ready to do it again. There was nothing terrible about that life. That's what made the decision so difficult. It wasn't a bad life. It just wasn't the one I wanted anymore. I emailed my old manager that afternoon. I thanked him. I told him the offer meant a lot to me, and I turned it down. My finger sat over the send button longer than I want to admit. Then I clicked it. And the second the message disappeared from my screen, I felt terrified. But underneath that, I felt relieved. Because this time, I hadn't accidentally ended up with the life I had. I had chosen it. I'd like to tell you I never questioned the decision again. I did. Every once in a while, I'd think about that salary and wonder how much I could have saved if I'd gone back. I just stopped letting that question run my life. And then I finally started doing what I had been talking about for years. I traveled. Not constantly. I still had a job and deadlines, and wherever I went, reliable internet suddenly became very important. But I could spend time exploring more of the Philippines. I could take a trip somewhere else in Southeast Asia and bring my work with me. Sometimes I worked from a hotel, sometimes a small apartment, a few times from a cafe where I'm pretty sure they were wondering when I was finally going to leave. It wasn't some perfect travel lifestyle. Flights got delayed, internet went down, I've booked rooms that looked nothing like the pictures. There were days when I didn't feel like exploring anything. But I was finally seeing places I'd spent years watching other people visit. The Philippines became the place I kept coming back to. After a while, I had my regular places. I knew where I liked to shop, where I liked to eat. I recognized people. I made a few friends. And I got much more comfortable doing things by myself. That surprised me. Back in America, I was around people all week because of work. Here, my circle was smaller, but I didn't feel as lonely as I had during those first couple of months. My income eventually got better too. Once I had some remote experience, I qualified for better work and took on more responsibility. I never got back to what I was making before, but I didn't need to. I'm not saying money stopped mattering. It didn't. I still needed savings, insurance, emergency money, a retirement plan. I just stopped feeling like every year of my life had to be about earning more than the year before. I still don't know exactly how long I'll stay in the Philippines. Maybe I'll live somewhere else someday. Maybe I'll spend more time traveling. Maybe I'll eventually go back to the United States. I don't feel like I have to figure all of that out right now. What I do know is that I don't miss spending an entire year waiting for a week or two of vacation. I still work. I still have annoying emails. I still have days when I don't want to log in. The difference is that my job doesn't decide where I have to live anymore. It doesn't decide whether I can see another country. It doesn't decide whether I'm allowed to leave for a few days. And I still think about that email from my old manager. They offered me more money than I'd ever made. 5 or 10 years earlier, I probably would have taken it without thinking twice. At 48, I looked at it differently. I had already spent more than 20 years telling myself I'd travel later. If I went back, I knew how easy it would be to start saying that again. Maybe next year. Maybe after the next raise. Maybe when I retire. I'm not saying everybody should quit a good job and move overseas. I wouldn't tell somebody else to make the decision I made. But for me, taking the smaller paycheck wasn't giving up on my future. It was finally making room for something besides work. I came to the Philippines at 48, alone, not retired, not rich, still working, and with a paycheck that was a lot smaller than the one I left behind. I thought I was giving up money so I could travel. What I really wanted was more say over my own days. That's what I found. And right now, that's enough.